Ron Howard has always been the cool head in the middle of trouble. A director who values decency, moderation, and gentleness. However, his demeanor immediately shifts when someone inquires about the less positive aspects of the field in which he grew up. He once commented in a low voice, "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped," as though he were opening a door that everyone else would rather keep closed. For Howard, Hollywood's heyday was never really golden. Silence, brutality, and unspoken laws that only insiders knew were its foundations. In that universe, being famous absolved one of all wrongdoing. Where, after the lights went out, the stars who by day built America's hopes could destroy countless lives. Ron Howard is now at last prepared to use the names that Hollywood formerly deemed untouchable, following decades of quiet. The demon behind the smile, Errol Flynn, is the first. Flynn was the epitome of charm, peril, and reckless adventure in Hollywood before there was a James Bond or Jack Sparrow. He was the ideal hero on screen. He was far more like a predator off-screen than a leading man. Flynn, who was born in Tasmania in 1909, came to Hollywood in the 1930s and became well known right away following Captain Blood in 1935. However, as his notoriety soared, so did the shady rumors about his deadly and volatile personal life. Everyone in the industry knew these stories, but nobody dared to speak them out loud. An era's defining icon was Errol Flynn. Additionally, it serves as a reminder that, despite Hollywood's most radiant exterior, there is always a dark side that most people are unaware of. Errol Flynn's charm was the foundation of the studio's entire empire, which they refined until it shone like gold. However, beyond that gleam, a man spiraled into addiction, excess, and conceit. Furthermore, the ideal Hollywood hero had turned into a national disgrace by 1942. Peggy Satley and Betty Hansen, two teenage girls, accused Flynn of statutory rape that year. The case split the nation in two once it became front-page news overnight. For some, he was ultimately shown as a monster. Others maintained that their intrepid hero was impervious to wrongdoing. Flynn showed no signs of fear during the trial. He chuckled. He made fun of the charges as though being famous were a shield that was impenetrable. Warner Brothers hired the priciest lawyers in California in a hurry to defend their star. Behind the scenes, executives discreetly made sure that some witnesses just vanished, while fans set up camp outside the courts. Even though Flynn was ultimately found not guilty, the decision did not save him. It set him free. He became louder, darker, and more careless. And the illusion was utterly destroyed in 1978 when a number of private letters came to light. Flynn boasted about his adventures, made fun of the women who were afraid of him, and exposed a man much more dangerous than the figure America loved. According to Ron Howard, reading about that trial was a game-changer for him. The realization that monsters might be protected by Hollywood as long as they grinned for the camera. Flynn continued to appear to the public as a charming outlaw. Insiders, however, saw him as a warning, a representation of what happens when power and celebrity supplant responsibility. He started to be consumed by alcohol, cocaine, and financial disaster. And in 1959, Errol Flynn's body eventually failed in Vancouver at the age of 50. A consequence of decades spent in excess. The autopsy of Errol Flynn revealed serious stomach ulcers, cirrhosis, and heart failure. For Ron Howard, however, the real cause was much more straightforward. He took everything and gave nothing, just as he had lived. Flynn's legacy served as a model for Hollywood's moral decline, a warning that no one is ever spared by celebrity and that charm may conceal cruelty. Then came the unrelenting fighter, Kirk Douglas. Douglas personified the most paradoxical aspect of the heyday of Hollywood. An actor who propagated shame and terror behind the scenes while preaching honor and justice on film. Douglas, who was born Iser Daniel Dan Lovick in 1916 to poor immigrant parents, overcame adversity by using his willpower alone. He had everything by the time Spartacus made him a global celebrity: riches, prestige, and an unstoppable reputation. Those closest to him at work, however, recalled a different man. They described a simmering fury that would suddenly flare up. Crew members reported times when an entire set could be destroyed by a single stare from Douglas, leaving performers and assistants completely frightened. Deborah Padette, an actress, once admitted that Douglas intended to dominate everyone in a situation, not just command it. Howard also noticed it as a new filmmaker observing Douglas's performances. He eventually acknowledged that beneath that smile is a sort of anger. That seething anger would plague Douglas for the remainder of his lengthy and complex career, the kind that gradually consumes a person from the inside out. Rumors about Kirk Douglas's treatment of women. Hollywood has been plagued by them for decades. His alleged involvement in the 1950s assault of rising star Natalie Wood, who was just 16 at the time, has long been alluded to by biographers and insiders. This claim resurfaced after Wood's death and was later recapped by her sister Lana in her 2018 memoir. Like so many influential men of his time, Douglas was never charged, and the narrative was lost in Hollywood's machine of silence. Even after he passed away in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy resurfaced as a sobering reckoning rather than as idle rumors. Douglas was a conundrum on set. He had the ability to inspire genius, while causing terror at the same time. Stanley Kubrick, a legendary filmmaker who collaborated with him twice, described him as the toughest to control and the most motivated man he had ever encountered. For Ron Howard, Douglas's career taught him more than just about skill or notoriety. It served as a power lesson. Douglas thought he was exempt from the rules, and most of Hollywood agreed. The world saw an elderly legend looking for acceptance and peace as he accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996. However, Howard noticed something more profound. The last action of a man who had dedicated his life to overcoming his own obstacles. Hollywood never wanted to confront the reality that was hidden beneath the cheers and flashing cameras. That some of its greatest legends were founded on fear rather than intelligence or moral character. The harsh queen is Faye Dunaway. If Kirk Douglas was the embodiment of unbridled anger and Errol Flynn was corruption, then Faye Dunaway was something colder. Beauty cloaked in cruelty. She was evidence to Ron Howard that violence was not always associated with evil in Hollywood. It occasionally manifested as ego, humiliation, and domination. So huge that everyone within its orbit was crushed. Dunaway, who was born in Baysham, Florida, in 1941, rose to prominence quickly. From Chinatown in 1974 to Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, she seemed invincible, a goddess of film, cold, alluring, and perfect. However, behind the glitz, rumors of her brutality circulated across the business. Crew members described being treated like disposable pawns in her empire of perfection, having tantrums, and having unending demands made of them. Rotanya Alda, her mommy dearest co-star, reportedly recollected, on set, you could feel the terror. Everyone was waiting for her to burst. Ironically, Dunaway apparently exhibited the same conduct she portrayed on TV as Joan Crawford, Hollywood's notorious queen of cruelty. Later, director Frank Perry acknowledged that her violent outbursts made him think about leaving the film completely. She once refused to film until the lighting made her appear amazing, hurled things, and yelled at makeup artists. She was cited by Ron Howard years later as the quintessential illustration of what occurs when an actor's desire for power turns into emotional terrorism. The tales only become more sinister. Dunaway allegedly spit on a crew worker and slapped a cameraman on the Wicked Lady. She allegedly degraded assistants on Don Juan DeMarco to the extent that production stopped for a whole day. Jay Bernstein, her former manager, put it simply. Faye transforms into divas rather than merely portraying them. Faye Dunaway's reputation finally caught up with her during the 2000s. Hollywood ceased to call. She was deemed uncontrollable by directors, who declined to collaborate with her. In 2011, Dunaway was let go from a Broadway production of Tay at the age of 5. Blaming everyone but herself. Ron Howard's response to a journalist's question regarding her legacy was restrained yet incisive. She lost compassion because she was so focused on achieving perfection. Dunaway's demise was gradual. It unraveled gradually. The once untouchable lady who dominated Hollywood with her cold genius ended up alone and shunned, even at her own movie retrospectives. She came to represent the price of brutality to Howard. A live reminder that skill devoid of compassion ultimately annihilates itself. His words, "People talk about power," once appeared. However, power without grace becomes poison in Hollywood. Then came the Western despot, John Wayne. Wayne was one of the most prominent people in Hollywood. For millions of people, he was the quintessential American, the man's man, the soldier, the daring cowboy. But the reality behind that tough mystique was much darker to Ron Howard, who grew up watching him rule black and white television screens. "When I learned who he really was," Howard said, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa, Wayne climbed the studio system by projecting a myth of unshakable masculinity. By the 1950s, he was no longer just an actor. He had become an ideology. Dissension was weakness. Progress was betrayal. On set, he ruled with fear. Technicians who failed to meet his expectations were cursed in front of everyone. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum recalled, "When Duke was angry, the atmosphere froze. Either you complied with his demands or you left." John Wayne's brutality extended well beyond the set. He publicly denigrated women, made fun of Native American actors in westerns, and threw out black actors who defied stereotypes. His notorious 1971 Playboy interview is still among the most unsettling documents of Hollywood's golden age. Ron Howard later characterized that setting as the antithesis of art, fear disguised as discipline. The words, which resurfaced decades later, sparked outrage, revealing not a patriotic hero but a man trapped in hate, selfishly holding on to land, that black people were not ready for self-governance, and that films needed men, not whiners. Wayne violently clashed with director John Ford on the set of The Searchers over Ford's insistence that a racist, vengeful Confederate named Ethan Edwards be portrayed sympathetically. In the final cut, the character's cruelty was evident, but so was the actor's contempt. "It's scary because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins," said Howard, who later analyzed the performance at USC. For filmmakers like Howard, Wayne's story served as a warning: power rooted in prejudice does not mature into wisdom, it curdles into bitterness. Even in his final years, weakened by cancer, Wayne never expressed regret. He dismissed critics as soft and blamed the changing culture for his isolation. Wayne died in 1979 at the age of 72. "I admired his films before I knew who he really was." Howard once acknowledged the unsettling duality that has plagued the industry for decades. "Then I realized that talent doesn't absolve a person, sometimes it hides them." Howard said that the myth survived, but the man behind it never deserved the legend. Then there was Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. To Howard, Polanski represented a truth Hollywood rarely confronts: brilliance can coexist with evil. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents and a survivor of Nazi occupation, Roman Polanski's rise was swift and nearly doomed from the beginning. He carried a shadow long before fame found him. His breakthrough films, Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, made him a visionary and a genius who could transform paranoia into poetry, but the darkness that haunted his films wasn't just fiction, it was a reflection of the man himself. That illusion was shattered in March 1977. After a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's house in Los Angeles, Polanski was arrested for the sexual assault of 13-year-old Samantha Gay. The evidence was damning, and he pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Before being sentenced, he fled the United States, fleeing to France and never coming back. Hollywood was divided, some condemned him outright, while others defended him as a tortured artist. For a young Ron Howard, witnessing the industry's reaction was heartbreaking. "They talked about art while a child's life was broken," he said years later. Hollywood's most permanent moral stains. He went on to direct overseas, receiving praise and even an Oscar for The Pianist in 2003. Howard said it was a sickening and surreal moment, and he stayed seated as the Dolby Theatre audience stood up to applaud. I thought about that 13-year-old girl and how that applause must have sounded to her ears. Howard saw the ultimate warning in Polanski's story: brilliance can be seductive, but it does not excuse cruelty. Talent may shine, but behind it, darkness can hide, and sometimes it thrives unhined. In a 2021 interview with Vanity Fair, Ron Howard reflected bitterly on Hollywood's willingness to separate genius from guilt, even decades later. When Roman Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters walked out in protest, and Howard saw the moment as a symbol of justice coming late but not too late. It had taken 40 years for the world to say what should have been said the day after the crime. A monster does not become less monstrous because he can frame a shot. Then there was Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Polanski stood for hypocrisy, Rooney represented illusion, the idea that charm could erase cruelty. Howard grew up enchanted by Rooney's upbeat musicals, but the truth behind his story was that it embodied everything that poisoned Hollywood's golden age, a system that protects the artist while abandoning the victim. He once said, "Hollywood forgives anything as long as the lighting is good." Rooney, who was born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, became Hollywood's first true child superstar and, by the age of 18, the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire on his grin, the all-American boy who sang, danced, and won hearts across the country, but behind the stunning performances, a darker reality unfolded. Howard once said, he was the face of joy, but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it. For Howard, Rooney's story, like those of Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, and Polanski, was a lesson etched in Hollywood's history. Brilliance may dazzle, but it can also hide darkness, and the industry often chooses to applaud the shine rather than confront the shadow. However, fame at Mickey Rooney's scale warped him early. He married 8 times, cheated relentlessly, gambled away millions, and humiliated those who loved him. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world, but behind closed doors, the darkness only grew. His 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his stepson were accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation in 2011, draining Rooney's finances and separating him from his family, but decades earlier, the harm Rooney caused to others had already become legendary. Former co-stars recalled him as erratic and cruel, and his closest friend from the MGM years, Judy Garland, confided in private, "He could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next." Garland, who was emotionally damaged and under pressure from studio executives, later implied that Rooney was partially to blame for her suffering. By the 1960s, Rooney's career had collapsed, and he was plagued by addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal. In a 1979 interview, he boasted, "I've lived 1,000 lives." However, as Ron Howard subsequently said, he had lived them all for himself. Rooney's resentment persisted into old age, and he held everyone, studios, spouses, and even God, responsible for his demise. His estate was worth less than $20,000 when he passed away in 2014 at the age of 93, and his body, which had been unclaimed at first, was eventually buried in Los Angeles after friends raised money for a modest funeral. For Howard, Rooney's story was the last in a painful pattern, proving that the smiles of the golden age were often masks, and that Rooney had made the world laugh while he was dying inside. Perhaps that is the most heinous act of evil, when suffering turns into a performance and no one notices. As Howard once remarked, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. Hollywood's golden age wasn't made of gold at all, but rather on silence, exploitation, and broken lives concealed beneath fame. Stories were never about retaliation, they were warnings. The illumination is meant to protect them. Which of these 6 actors, the tyrant, the smiling liar, or the predator, shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments.